A self-redemption or evading criticism? The Chinese parliament is debating a revised criminal law that has been hailed by the state for limiting police powers, but it is still criticised by human rights and political activists as not going far enough. Is China finally opening up? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Stephen Cole. China is set to pass a landmark piece of legislation, the country's new criminal procedure law. The draft law was submitted to China's parliament, but critics say it continues to give unfettered powers to the police to detain those suspected of what China calls endangering national security. Well, the new law is expected to ban secret detention centres, known as black jails, where people are held without charge. Melissa Chan joined relatives of the missing who are seeking answers about their family members at one such facility in Beijing.
Leung says her daughter was kidnapped by state agents and taken here, an ad hoc holding facility. This is one way to control ordinary citizens in possession of evidence of government corruption. Liu's daughter had managed to gain access to a phone the night before to tell her mother where she was.
This is a black jail. What in Chinese is called 黑监狱. It's a place for police to capture people without arrest, without charge, and basically disappear them.
In the gloomy halls, Mrs. Liu realizes it's too late. The prisoners had been moved. Black jails are illegal detention centers that allow authorities to bypass the law. In front of cameras, the unidentified men are afraid to take too much action. I ask one of them where they've taken Mrs. Liu's daughter. He tells me she is safe, but he couldn't explain why the detained woman's own family had not been told of her whereabouts.
So as you can see, the situation is that there are black jails despite the new criminal procedure law that's going to be passed at this year's National People's Congress, preventing exactly this type of thing from happening. Family members not informed of the disappearances of their loved ones by police.
They demand the end to secret detentions. They know this is illegal. This man says the police are liars, you are bullies, and they unfurl messages of corruption, beatings, unsavory government activities. Finally, uniformed police show up. They film us filming them. Mrs. Liu begs them to help find her daughter. Shortly after, officers asked that we stop our camera. This is what the new criminal code is supposed to prevent, but the showpiece legislation will only matter if it is actually enforced.
According to the new law, family members of those arrested or held should be informed within 24 hours.
But tell that to Mrs. Liu and her friends. The police have arrived, but they showed no indication they shut down this black jail or others in the city, despite what the law says. Melissa Chan, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
So the question for Inside Story is China finally opening up? To answer that question and some others too, we're joined by our guests in Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, political analyst and former representative to the UK for the Hong Kong government. In Paris, Francois Godement, professor of political science and director for strategy of Asia Centre. In New York, Phelim Kine, a senior Asia researcher with New York-based Human Rights Watch. Welcome, all of you. Let's open with Francois, though. It's Wen Jiabao's final year in office. Are we looking at China at a crossroads, a new China on the horizon? And if not, what's prompted the introduction of these new procedures?
I think we have had a very contradictory process here. First of all, the new criminal process law was presented to the public last August and submitted for public comment. That is unprecedented for such an important legislative act. So in a way, the process has been more in the open than at any time previously, and that, of course, is to, the regime must be credited for this. Second, the law seemed to incorporate welcome developments. The presence of lawyers for most, if not all, parts of the process, recording for interrogations in case of capital crimes, camera recordings. In other words, an attempt to diminish the number of forced confessions and an explicit condemnation of torture, which is welcome, of course, given the context in China. But on the other hand, in the middle of this new legislative act, a stipulation legalizing literally secret arrest and detention for 6 months incommunicado, without news to the family, for example, without a lawyer, and on a wide quantity of crime. That caught the attention of not only human rights organizations, but of the Chinese public, and especially because well-known dissidents had been submitted to exactly this.
Exactly. Well, let's go to Human Rights Watch. Phelim, under new rules, police who thrust citizens into their feared house arrest, known as residential surveillance, must notify the prisoner's family within 24 hours. Is that a sort of progress?
It's very limited progress in the sense that it still gives a wide latitude to the state security agencies to hold and detain suspects for long periods of time incommunicado. Now, in China, why is that a problem? Well, the fact is in China, it's well documented that torture and ill treatment of suspects, even in detention facilities which lawyers and family have access to, is a routine and common problem. So putting suspects incommunicado in a place which is outside of any detention facility which only the police know about, it raises significantly the risk to the health, security, and safety of suspects.
And Andrew, why has China decided to exact this new law now? In other words, is there any positive significance in the timing?
Well, indeed, China is at a crossroads because you can see that number of civil unrests is rising quite rapidly. Some estimates have put it as many as 128,000 in the past year, and this threatens the stability of China's governance. And also, for example, if you look at what happened at a very high-profile protest in a village in Wuhan, that resulted in a complete reversal of a decision made by the authorities. This highlights the kind of inequalities, the lack of social justice in the system itself. So, and of course, with the organized civic action, not only in China but across the world. So the Chinese leadership is very much alive to this threat. So the improvement of the criminal law is only one step in that direction. And you can see that a recent World Bank report, which has just been released, that has been compiled with the Development Research Center of the State Council, a very, very high-profile state organ. And in that report, it highlights a whole range of reforms, both in terms of the role played by state-owned enterprises, the development of civil society, the guaranteeing of minimum standards of living for the vast majority of the people. So China is, in fact, the President Hu Jintao, when he took power 5 years ago, already highlighted the need to build a harmonious society.
Exactly.
And the society has turned less harmonious. So this is a step in that direction.
In that direction, because of the lack of harmony indicated by the World Bank in that report. Let's have a look at the main points of the law. The amended Criminal Procedure Law, as it's called, was presented to the current session of the National People's Congress and was touted by official websites as China highlights human rights. But it's been described as a law that would legalize secret detentions. It's been criticized by lawyers, activists and international rights groups. So what does the new law contain? Well, it still allows police to detain suspects without informing their families, especially those accused of endangering national security, terrorism or serious bribery. House surveillance means holding a suspect at a location other than a jail. These makeshift prisons have come to be known as black jails, and suspects held in them often report torture at the hands of police. The new draft does, for the first time, make clear that confessions extorted through illegal means such as torture and testimony of witnesses and depositions of victims obtained illegally, such as by violence or threats, should in future be excluded during the trials. Well, last year was the most repressive in over a decade for those defending human rights in China. That's according to a report from the Hong Kong-based Chinese Human Rights Defenders. The Chinese Human Rights Group says 2011 was a year of harsh crackdowns characterized by lengthy prison sentences, extended use of illegal detention, and enforced disappearances and torture. The key findings of the report are as follows. Well, last year, the group documented almost 4,000 cases of individuals arbitrarily detained for their work in defence of human rights, and there were 159 incidences of torture. The vast majority of human rights defenders were held in black jails and house arrest. Now, also in 2011, 1 in 4 activists suffered torture or enforced disappearance, and 2 out of 3 were monitored or harassed for their activities. The most recent wave of detentions was started in February last year by an anonymous bulletin urging Chinese citizens to publicly demand political change. And so, back to you, Andrew, but briefly, if you will, Andrew, do you detect a call for public change from within China?
Well, as far as the criminal law reform is concerned, at least it lays down certain procedures, clearly defined procedures against what was perceived as a very arbitrary system. And you can see that this so-called black jail is coming up is because there are a lot of not protesters but petitioners who fail to get their cases heard or get their grievances addressed in the provinces. And they're flocking to the capital, Beijing, to present the petitions. But many a time they were detained by provincial functionaries sent to Beijing to put them away from the eyes of the leaders.
Which is
so
what
again,
this new law is supposed to. Which is what this new law is supposed to address. Francois, can the new criminal procedure law, the criminal law procedure, really be implemented, do you think?
I think it will have to be applied by local authorities, and that is where the difficulty lies. Just as this law was being discussed during these very last few days, a representative to China's National Assembly from Sichuan, actually from Chongqing, spoke out about the mass movements and arrests in his home city and the role of a controversial police chief there. While he was on the phone, arrested in Beijing by representatives of the police from his home province, and this happened just a few weeks ago. So the question of how to regulate the control of security organizations is really a huge one. But I want to stress that because of the public nature of the discussion, the controversial article on what we call secret arrest or disappearances has actually been toned down. It is far from perfect. There are still loopholes which arbitrary power can exploit, but there is a change of tone which has happened over the last few weeks.
And let's go to Phelim, because that's interesting what Francois was saying. Do you detect at Human Rights Watch a change of tone, Phelim?
There might be a change of tone, but I think that the key is that there is not a change in substance. And I think it's worth pointing out 2 important points. Number one, whatever benefits that might come from this revised criminal procedure law, it will not address at all the issue of black jails. The Chinese government adamantly refuses to admit that black jails even exist. It's worth noting that in March 2010, when the Chinese government went to the United Nations for an examination of its human rights record, it said on record, black jails do not exist in China. So that's an important point. The second point is, what does it mean in terms of substance rather than tone? We have seen over the last 5 years the ascendancy of the security agencies in China. This is the key issue. The Chinese government sees the country as this pressure cooker, this yawning rural-urban wealth gap, rampant corruption, epic environmental degradation, and it's trying hard to keep control. It has a 62-year monopoly on power, and it sees the law and using the security agencies as a means to maintain power at whatever way it can. So there's a glaring disconnect between the rhetoric and what actually is happening on the ground in China.
Which may explain why the budget for internal security is even greater than the defence budget. But let's widen this now, and I want to stay with Phelim for a moment. How aware, do you think, or how concerned is China about how it's regarded globally in terms of human rights?
Well, the Chinese government does care about its international image. It doesn't want to be seen as this pariah, with a soiled human rights record, and it also has this ongoing effort to, for a soft power development, particularly in the developing world. And this whole criminal procedure law revision is also part of the recognition within the government and within the legal community in China that China's laws need to be commensurate and need to match those of the international community. So on paper, things are progressing, and on paper, things are looking better.
And Francois, do you think, the politics of reform in China? How much or how little is Beijing looking outwards?
I think this is playing a role. Because just weeks before this discussion of the new criminal law happened, there was the extraordinary Chongqing story with the police chief of the security chief of a region that has about 40 million people who tried to defect, went into the US consulate there, and it transpired that Chongqing has been having literally a terror campaign on suspects. These suspects may be triads, may be criminals, but clearly the movement went very far. And this has made a lot of noise in China. I think it has empowered liberals or advocates of legal rule to speak more openly in the past few weeks. This has been overwhelmingly reported in the internet media, if not in the official media. And I think it is having an influence. And what we're seeing here shifts at the last minute in the content of this criminal law probably reflects these new grounds in China.
And Andrew Leung, you mentioned earlier the World Bank report, which of course was talking about a harmonious China, which what the Chinese leadership hoped to build, but it hasn't happened yet. So this new law, how would you assess the size of the step forward in trying to build this harmonious China?
Well, it is only a very, very small step. I mean, at the end of the day, what China lacks is a completely independent judiciary, and that question hasn't been addressed. So even though you have the perfect laws and regulations, but it's when it comes to the court, if the court is not seen to be entirely independent of the provincial authorities, then the rule of law rather than the rule by law is not being upheld. Okay. And so unless that is being addressed, the problem has not been solved.
Okay. Francois, last month, going to Francois now, last month, China's leader in waiting, Xi Jinping, you remember, I'm sure, told President Obama, China is willing to take concrete steps to improve human rights, and that will happen when he takes charge. Now, was that a soundbite, a piece of rhetoric, or do you think he's sincere about changing or raising the bar of human rights?
I think that China has again accepted forms of dialogue. I think the theme appears clearly in the drafting of this criminal law. It's a very contradictory situation. The problem with the leaders, the problem with somebody like Xi Jinping, is that he and the Communist Party do not equate due process with the separation of powers. So we have the paradox, of a system that is trying to regulate its own excesses, but as was said by a previous speaker, doesn't provide for an independent judiciary. There is minimal oversight by the public, and they are struggling, with this issue. How do you keep a system that doesn't separate powers, yet you check some of its worst excesses?
And reading the World Bank report, Phelim, I'm going to come to you, Phelim. The World Bank also reported that China is amongst the most unequal countries in Asia. Do you think Beijing worried about the sort of anti-authoritarian uprisings that we've seen in the Arab world moving towards China?
The Chinese government is definitely extremely concerned about this yawning rural-urban wealth gap and about inequality and how it might possibly feed instability. And what we saw in early 2011 was that in the aftermath and during the Arab Spring movement in the Middle East and North Africa, the Chinese government cracking down viciously on human rights defenders, civil society activists, and that's where we saw these mass enforced disappearances of the proponents of positive social change in China. And this is a trend that's continuing. And the challenge for the incoming leadership of Mr. Xi and Mr. Li Keqiang is, are they willing to take a stand against the security agencies? Are they willing to do something very simple, to enforce China's laws and to enforce and respect the laws and freedoms, rights and freedoms in China's own constitution? That's what the victims of this campaign against human rights defenders and civil society in China, that's all they are asking for.
And Andrew Leung, can the Chinese leadership, the current and the future Chinese leadership, make any sort of laws that perhaps soften human rights when it has such an unequal society and the gap between classes is widening all the time?
So it's not just the question of changing the law or defining the regulations. It's the question of creating a more vibrant civil society. It's the question of guarding, as I was saying, the people's rights, for example, the land grabs and so on. It's also the question of empowering the ordinary citizens to gather their input, for example, through the internet into drafting laws. So all these are happening already, and this is necessitated, in fact, by the growth of the middle class. A middle class which is much more educated. Figures are out that's saying that China would have something like 200 million university graduates, and then most of these people are internet enabled and would have their own aspirations. So this creates a kind of momentum which the leadership has to address.
And Francois, is that how you see it in this year of once in a decade political change? There is some momentum.
There is some momentum again, more than would have been expected only a few months ago, and you can sense a debate at the top. And in a way, the fact that this law is being debated and that there are public opinions expressed on the internet, it's already something. But I want to point out that there are really very, very serious loopholes. One of the facts that hasn't been mentioned so far in the discussion, for example, is that people can come under this secret detention system just because they are accused of corruption, which is, an economic crime. Well, in China, the definition of economic crime stretches very far. That is probably the most likely circumstance under which any white-collar individual is likely to be arrested. And so this is a loophole that still opens a lot of arbitrary power. We should remember, for example, that one of the most prominent dissidents in Beijing was arrested and detained secretly for evading his taxes. So an economic crime, in a way, indirectly. So it's a very ambiguous and contradictory situation. I think we can see very strongly a movement to move towards legality, and we can see dark forces which are very hard to identify, which are still operating outside of legality.
Well, in theory, In theory, the human rights changes will bring positive changes, as we've heard, but whether or not they're implemented will be decided by new leadership. Only then will we see if they're changes for good. Thanks to our guests in Hong Kong, Leung, in Paris, Francois Godement, and in New York, Phelim Kine. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From me, Stephen Cole. Thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.